press the record button. Okay, let's make a formal start. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second panel on compound cascading and lingering disasters. So first of all, I would like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians on the lands on which we meet. And for me, that is the Ngunnawal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Disaster Risk Science Institute runs regular seminars on a monthly basis and occasionally puts on these special panels. All of our presentations, which are done online, are recorded and they will be made available on our website, which is drsi.anu.edu.au. And you've got that link in the chat box. And again, apologies for how long it took me to load last week's presentation, but it is available on the website now. So today's panel continues looking at the theme of compound cascading and lingering disasters. And we're focusing on resilience. So last week there was a focus on defining these categories of disasters and looking at vulnerability. And today we are focusing on resilience. Now we've got 4 expert speakers lined up who will give each give a 15-minute presentation, and then we will have some time for questions at the end, and we aim to finish at 1:30 p.m. So without any further delay, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Deborah O'Connell, who is a principal research scientist at the CSIRO, and she will be speaking on building resilience. So over to you, Deb.
Thanks very much, Anna, and hello, everybody. I'm speaking to you today from Bermagui on the coast of southern New South Wales. It's Yuin country, and I too acknowledge the custodianship and care shown to the land by the Yuin people, and acknowledge their leaders, past, present, and emerging. My talk today is a follow-on from the presentation that Nikki Grigg gave last week, where she focused on the vulnerability, what causes system vulnerability, and I'm going to pick up and take on the next step, which is how do we go from vulnerability to resilience. I'm going to do a quick whistle-stop tour of where Nikki left you last week, so that for those of you who weren't here, you can give get a quick overview before we focus on the resilience aspects. So this talk is on behalf of a number of people. As you can see, this is a very brief overview of quite a large body of work, most of it co-designed and co-developed with partners in a whole range of state agencies, federal agencies, and with other stakeholders, including community. So I've tried to put links, acknowledgements of all of the authors, and links to all of the reports that we're drawing on here. What I want to do first is ask you to just take a moment. If we were in a workshop situation, I'd ask you to do this and potentially put it into your phone so that it could create a word cloud online, but we're not really able to do that. Maybe what you can do is write in the chat. And Anna, I could ask you when we come to this in a later slide to give a quick summary of the sorts of answers that were provided. I want you first to place yourself in Christmas Eve 2018 and remember where you were. Remember what it felt like, what it smelled like, and how you felt. And think about what the 3, if I asked you on that evening, what were the top 3 things that you valued and prioritized at that moment? What would those 3 things have been? You can write in the chat if you want, but otherwise just make a mental note. It's a reflective start. So I'm going to ask you the same question again, but I'm going to ask you to place yourself on New Year's Eve 2020. If you were in Southeast Australia, which some of you are, but not all of you are. You probably were watching the news, even if you weren't directly in the line of the bushfires. First, then, what were the top 3 things you valued on New Year's Eve, and maybe the week following? What would you have prioritised? And I'm going to ask you a third time. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, so maybe not now, but maybe a couple of months ago, particularly if you were in Melbourne, or maybe even today if you're in South Australia, what would be the top 3 things of value that you would prioritise? I wanted to start this with that reflective moment for yourself, and I want you to remember the answers that you gave, because we're going to come back to this. The sorts of things that each of us value as individuals, and how these are translated to drive societal systems is where we're going next. So we're not talking here foundational things, maybe the sorts of values described by Schwartz, for example, that often stay very stable through a person's lifetime. We're talking about what we call assigned values or relational values, the things that you value, and how dependent they are upon context. So hopefully that simple exercise would have shown you, Anna, maybe you could just give me a couple of examples of what came up for the first couple.
So we had one response, can I cope with the extended family tomorrow? And I guess that would be for the 2018 Christmas Eve. Another response was safety for people and places in 2020. And New Year 2020, glad not to be near bushfires.
Yeah. So typically when we've done these sorts of examples, people will value, or probably go from wondering how they're going to cope with extended family the next day to, you know, once something's really threatened, being desperately worried about those same extended family members that you might have been wondering how you would cope with the year before. You know, things that typically come out when we talk about COVID, sense of loneliness, you know, valuing being able to go to work, valuing personal freedoms that we've taken completely for granted, valuing clean air and water in the case of bushfires. So the point is that these things are extremely context dependent, these assigned values and relational values. And they change with context, but there are tensions within each human, and we had a beautiful one just there, that the tension between wondering how you're going to cope with family over Christmas compared to really valuing what would happen if something threatened them. But there are also different relationships and tensions with different stakeholders. So for example, you might value a home not only for its bricks and mortar value, but an insurance company will value it for its economic value, while you might value it for its shelter, its memories that it holds, and many other things besides. So the point is that there are tensions between values, and these change with context. When we did this work with through running catastrophic disaster workshops, which Nikki described in more detail last week, we know that there are some really clear tensions in values between the things that we value on the left, which are things that we value when things are stable and times of relative stability and prosperity, compared to when things are more threatened, are the things on the right that we might value. And the way that these values are scaled up from individuals and groups to more societal systems is through what we simplify as a values, rules and knowledge trilogy. For decisions to be credible and legitimate and legal, they need to coincide with the things that society values. So society needs to want it and prioritise it. There needs to be enough knowledge so that we know what to do, and the rules need to enable it. And this combination of things either enables or constrains the decisions of individuals and groups. And of course, that has a relationship with the power, but I'm not going to go to those things in detail at the moment. But this combination of things actually drives the configuration of a whole range of our systems in society. And when we did the work with deconstructing disasters, we found that there were a number of very typical patterns, either vicious patterns or virtuous patterns of the way systems behaved. For provisioning systems, which are the ones that are going across, or for behaviours, social capacities and social processes. These systems behave in very typical ways, and we tried to start unpacking those in a very qualitative way in the work that we did in deconstructing disasters, which is described in the Australian Vulnerability Profile, and the links are there. So the broad narrative that comes out of this is that people value things differently, that the values can be in tension, particularly during times of stability and prosperity compared to times of disruption, that these combinations of values, knowledge and rules drives and configures systems which set us up all right for times of stability. The key dependencies shown in the 3 discs is that these are suspended. Imagine this suspended, and that if you cut off the top suspension to environment at the top, society and economy, the whole lot comes crashing down. And after a disaster, we have some choices. Typically, what happens is that people want to restore what they lost as quickly as they can. That's a very human thing to want to do. But what it does is reinforce the same vulnerabilities that were there. Doing things better is important, and we've moved to talking about doing things better. Typically, that involves something like a royal commission. Some learning is uncovered about what went wrong, where the system fails were. That provides more knowledge. We might fiddle around with a few rules, but essentially we're not really reconfiguring and fundamentally changing the systems. And where Nikki left you with last week was that if we really want to reconfigure the systems and build resilience, we have to do things differently. So most of the focus of what I'm going to go through now is how do we do things differently? It's very easy to say, but of course it's really tricky to do. And we don't know actually how to do this. If there were off-the-shelf solutions already, we probably would have done it. But although there are many technologies in place that can help towards those solutions, unless they are embedded in people's daily decisions and choices and behaviours, they by themselves don't provide the solutions. So I'm going to give you a very quick overview of some of the tools and approaches and key messages that we've come to so far about how to create those new systems and support others in implementing them. So over the last, probably since about 2013, a whole group of people, many of whom are listed on the front page, or all of whom are listed on the front page, were funded initially by the Global Environment Facility and UNDP, and eventually Stockholm Resilience Centre and the GRADE Partnership, to try and distill a lot of the thinking around resilience, adaptation and transformation. Brian Walker and Nick Abel were part of this team, as were many other international authors, really to try and take what we'd learnt and distill them into a set of guidelines, trying to take the dissonance out of some of the concepts and the way they were applied, talking about how to make key interventions in the system informed by the concepts so that we could make change in an intentional way, always to move towards a sustainability goal. So not resilience for resilience sake or adaptation for adaptation's sake, but really always trying to focus on the goal and combine qualitative and quantitative approaches. And we came up with this approach called RAPTA, Resilience, Adaptation, Pathways and Transformation, which we can use to design processes and research projects, as well as the actual interventions and implementation of them on the ground. We've applied it in many places around the world, but to bring us to our current context and the sorts of places that these ideas can manifest, and the importance of the first cog, we call it, which is people, values, vision and dialogue, which is often very underdone in a scientific context. There's a really, really critical thing that we need to do, especially with the sort of audience that we've got online today, which is to take the responsibility of moving beyond just talking about the risk and the threats and how to manage the threats, but also to try and support and inspire and make place for those visions that actually drive us forward, those inspiring visions. And here's a couple of examples, really different ways of doing things. One is BBC has, as behind the scenes augmented reality app to support the Big Weather series, come up with a town that is designed to be resilient. This was done in collaboration with BOM and CSIRO and many other experts around the country. You use it on your phone, and I took some screenshots today. My dog's not dead in the background, she's just having a snooze. But this town pops up, and you can run various catastrophes over it, like bushfires and floods and big storms, but you can go into each of the features on that landscape. And we've constructed the narrative arcs supported by science about the adaptations, what would happen for this to do really well if those catastrophes that happen in the future come along, because we know they're going to happen and we don't want to just show the destruction side of things. This is the town that shows what doing it differently means. On the right-hand side, going from the augmented reality and fantasy world to the actual reality of what's happening on the ground. I am situated in Wallaga Lake, which is about 10 minutes from Cabargo. This last weekend, these are photos from last weekend of the community getting together to start plotting out what doing it differently means for Cabargo, and capturing the story of what happened, thinking about what parts of the system and what parts of the values they want to keep and what was making them vulnerable and what needs to change. So these ideas are starting to be translated in a whole range of different ways. They need to be supported by systems analysis, and I'm not going to go through the participatory systems analysis that we've developed, but building on Newell and Prowse from ANU and many other participatory systems, we go through a process, boil it down to critical systems dynamics to try and work out where and how to intervene, and then wrap that in a narrative, but use it to really try and plot some of the interventions. And this is an example that came from Australian Vulnerability Profile. This is one of the simple ones about social learning systems and the role of blame. So the midst of disasters is not the time to be learning about basic survival, but the problem is that many of our systems are on the left in a vicious cycle. Individuals don't know what to do, local groups struggle to form, they're not resourced, difficulties bring out the worst in each other, and then learning is hampered by trauma. On the right-hand side, this is what the system would look like in its virtuous cycle. And then what we do is try and take people really through thinking about what sorts of values, knowledge and rules would underpin the vicious version of that cycle, and what would underpin a virtuous form of that cycle. And then start working out pathways, sequence sets of actions about how you move from one on the left to one on the other. And we've started to do that with groups for many of those systems that I showed you earlier on, those 15 typical system patterns. But these are tools that can be used, and we hope they will be used by groups, and trying to combine these kind of qualitative tools then with the quantitative modelling capacities that many of the organisations sitting around the table in the seminar actually have. I'm going to finish with taking you to the cutting edge of this thinking about how to try and combine qualitative approaches I've given you a glimpse of with some of the quantitative approaches, taking it right through trying to work out how to prioritise our investments and look at different kinds of revenue streams for funding the extra cost of those resilience, building resilience into our systems. So it's about combining the sort of qualitative design options that we've got on the left that I've given you a brief glimpse of with RAPTA, with some of the work in the middle that was put forward as part of the guidance for strategic climate and risk reduction, really trying to unpack that bottom cog of RAPTA, the options and pathways to action. Once you've generated these options and sequenced some pathways, how do you actually get the values that you want to capture monetized and invested in the middle, and then try and embed that in the development of infrastructure proposals that are being put forward, and trying to attract some of the private sector capital investment, as well as government money, as well as these new models that are emerging around community ownership of assets, etc. How do we bring all of these tools together and try and use it to plan our way forward in this recovery phase? This is work in progress. Some bits of it are published in the parts that I've labelled below, but we're actively working with value advisory partners and CSIRO on trying to systematise this approach. So these are some of the approaches and thinking, some of the qualitative things around the importance of narrative and vision and community engagement and different types of stakeholder relationships, working across different types of actors that we need to develop these collective actions and these different ways of doing things. And the key messages: we really need a systems approach. We can't overemphasize enough the importance of the values, the vision, the dialogues, the narratives, and moving beyond the risk reduction narratives we had to an inspirational mindset. Combining the qualitative approaches that I've sort of emphasized in this, knowing that Melissa is going to come along after me and talk about the more quantitative approaches, and catalyzing that collective coordinated action across multiple actors. And I've tried to present you some of the brief overview of the methodological approaches that we have and the emerging new approaches and partnerships that we have to support these. So thanks everyone, and I'm going to hand to the next speaker now.
Thank you very much, Deb, for that. And Steve Lade gave a really nice example to your original question about the differences in values in 2018, 2019, and 2020. So we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Mark Crosweller, who has had a very long and distinguished career in the emergency service sector. And he is the former head of the National Resilience Task Force, former Director General of Emergency Management Australia, and the former Director of the Australasian Fire and Emergency Service Authorities Council, which is AFAC. And he's currently the Director of Ethical Intelligence, and he is presenting a talk on resilience, risk reduction, and vulnerability, a conversation, and a case study. So I'm going to be doing the slides for Mark. So I'm just sharing my screen now, and like this.
You've just given the game away, Anna.
Sorry?
You've just given the game away. That's the last slide.
Oh, whoopsie. There we go. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Anna. Good afternoon, everybody. Deb, Mel, Tom, nice to see you. It's, your presentation, Deb, brings back so many great memories, actually. I think all those who worked with the task force, of which there were literally hundreds, and I know Mark Howden's on the line as well, who was instrumental in also guiding us in some advice. It was really nice to see how much of that work, I think, has pervaded into the Royal Commission, for example, and into further into government policy and all the things that good public policy does, actually. And I think, I certainly commend the government for setting up the task force, but I commend equally all those who participated in the process. And I think we really have been able to make a difference and to make a step change in the sector. So it's really nice to be here. So I've been out of government about 9 months now, still finding my feet in the private sector and finishing my PhD. I think, Anna, you noted me as Dr. Mark Crosweller. Thank you for the ascension, but I'm not quite there yet, but I hope to be there in the first quarter of next year. So
yes, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun.
It's maybe you're more visionary than I am, but so look, this first photo, I just wanted to, I use it a lot, actually. It's from the NOAA satellite of the New Year's Eve or New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. I think it was New Year's Day this year. Back to Deb's point about how do we all feel about what was happening. If you look towards the top right-hand part of that slide, you'll see the coast of Australia, the south coast of Australia. I think it's Jervis Bay. I'm not 100% sure. It looks like Jervis Bay. And then if you look to the left of that, you can see an enormous amount of fire. and it gives you a sense of scale. And then to the bottom right of the photo, you can see a pyrocumulonimbus cloud forming, which is essentially a thunderstorm coming off the fireground. And that's what we are now dealing with as an exemplar of what the climate and the weather is capable of producing when it intersects with a landscape under such adverse condition. And we are still largely perpetuating messages that haven't really shifted about how we deal with these things. And it does concern me, and has done for some time, about the need for a strategic step change in policy and the way we look at these disasters and the way we approach them. And I think the work of the task force kind of intimated some of those things that we needed to think about. So it's a really powerful image. I think that the heat, the force, the energy that incident is giving off is phenomenal. And we still have people in the sector that talk about hazard reduction and speak of risk only from a hazard perspective. But what last summer produced in the context of dryness, drought, vulnerability, susceptibility, flammability, would lead me to think that if we only stick with the hazard narrative, we're going to get ourselves in a real pickle. So if we go to the next slide, this is what the Royal Commission said. It said many things, of course, but two things that really stuck out for me when I read the report last week. And I had made this point of the Royal Commission, as had a number of other people, so nothing I contributed to the Commission I don't think was unique, but it was certainly a reinforcing proposition, was that unprecedented is not a reason to be unprepared. I mean, I think the words I used was unprecedented doesn't mean surprising. And the reason I say that is because we have, in fact, been talking about the manifestation of these events like last summer for about 20 years or more, particularly in the climate science space, but also in emergency management and in disaster management more broadly. So the physical manifestation, or that when reality turned up, was really not surprising. And whilst there might have been some statistical aspects of last summer which were unprecedented in terms of the numbers, I don't think we can hang our hat on the fact that we didn't expect this thing to happen. And there may have been some micro surprises in the mix, and I get that, and particularly at the individual level, with enormous degrees of variation in experience and knowledge and understanding. There would, of course, be lots of surprises for individuals in that context, but at a policy level, at the meta level or the macro level, really no surprises at all. And yes, unprecedented statistically, but really not surprising. And the extent to which we did prepare for it, I think, it was right for the Royal Commission to put that proposition and also to leave us with a legacy to think about. And the other comment I want to make is this: if institutions don't actually implement what the Royal Commission has asked for, then we are going to shift the risk to others. And we've already done that in quite significant ways over the last 15 to 20 years. And I'll talk very briefly about that. I'll probably leave you with more questions than answers, which is the point of this conversation. There is, I think, a significant bias towards individual responsibility rather than institutional responsibility. And if you look at the history of commissions of inquiry, whether they're royal commissions or coronial inquiries or other inquiries, the institutional deficiencies that come up in the recommendations are quite pronounced. The New South Wales review, the South Australian review, the Royal Commission review really shows where we've pulled back, stepped back, or haven't stepped up in the institutional sense to provide a level of comfort or safety or assurance to the extent of which, a full extent of which an institutional framing is able to allow people to exercise resilience to the extent to which they are able. And so I think the burden is upon the individual, I think, is significantly pronounced and needs to be rebalanced. And my recent publication last week speaks to that, and the next publication will speak to it probably more. If we go to the next slide, just really quickly, what I learned over the course of my career, of course, was that disasters of all descriptions are much more a matter of the heart than the head. How people feel about these things is equally important, if not more so, than what they think about them. And to Deb's point about values absolutely shift and change over time, and they certainly shift through a disaster, and they tend to consolidate and become more universal. But without some sort of alternative safe experience to put people through to discover that alternative set of values, it's often not understood until after the event. Communities transform, people transform, institutions transform to a degree. They are, in every sense of the word, a transformational process, and I think a lot more could be said about that. And I think we could put in place processes to allow people to experience that transformational aspect of crisis to try and get ahead of the game at a policy level and at a preparedness level in community. And of course, they're not natural. And I've been big on this point for some time, as is the literature, of course, that it's really where society has not adequately prepared for the intersection between itself and the forces of nature. And those forces, of course, are intensifying and becoming more frequent. And if society doesn't make adjustments to deal with that, as well as mitigating, of course, the underlying effects of that intensification and increase in frequency, then we cannot continue to label them as natural disasters. And that point was made quite clear in the Commission, and the Commission accepted the proposition. It wasn't able to change the discourse through the report, of course, because natural disaster discourse is so entrenched in our psychology. But it did make the observation that that they weren't really natural, that there's a lot more that we could do than we would give ourselves perhaps credit for. If we go to the next slide, this is what I took from the media through last summer, because I wasn't actively involved. First time in 35 years, I didn't have a statutorily responsible position in crisis. I was able to do a bit of research on what the front pages were saying in the media, and it was essentially those 6 messages were coming out of governments and from commissioners and premiers and other people. And it's just, if you ask yourself the question, is that a good space to be in from a public policy perspective, that this is where we end up, where governments can do no more, safety cannot be guaranteed, losses will inevitably occur. You can read it for yourselves, of course, prepare for catastrophic events, the inevitability of death, and abandon your localities. And I think that concerns me a lot, that if that is the key message coming out of governments, underpinned by unprecedented. So unprecedented was linked to this discourse as though there was nothing more we could do. And I think it opens up a substantial conversation and debate about what it is we can actually do to make sure we don't end up in quite this position into the future, where this becomes the key messaging. If we go to the next slide, vulnerability, and Deb talked about this, and I'm sorry, I didn't see the presentation last week, unfortunately I was caught up, but it was good to hear the vulnerabilities front and centre because it is so critical. It is, of course, the susceptibility to be harmed and the inability to cope and adapt, but it's also the basis of relatedness and relationship. And those two things are almost dichotomous, really, but simultaneous. So they sit in tension, but they sit side by side. And I think it's really important from a leadership perspective, and much of my PhD is premised upon this, is that the failure to recognise vulnerability in and of oneself necessarily results in the failing to see vulnerability in and of others. And the institutional decisions that we make and the leadership in our institutions, I think, is sometimes moves to an invulnerable posture, a masterful posture, or a posture that doesn't fully acknowledge or appreciate the potentiality of the suffering of another human being. I don't say that with any sense of moral judgment, but it is an ethical issue. And I think the question, which I'll leave the forum with today, is, how do we move down a pathway that makes much more of a related connection between the citizen and the institution about the potential to suffer and to experience harm. If we move to the next slide, this is a whirlwind tour through usually 1.5 hour presentation, Hannah, so I'll do the best I can. Many of you would have seen this slide before. Petra and I published on this 12 months ago. It says a lot, of course. The main distinction I want to make is that if you look at the down the bottom of intensity of event, you've got from low to moderate through to catastrophic. We were definitely in catastrophic last summer, and we were definitely in the red zone, which was where the actual consequences far exceeded our capacity or capability to cope or to mitigate or to treat the risk. So this heuristic was developed 3 or 4 years ago, basically taking historical data and looking at the trends and looking at where we thought we would end up. There's some examples there, of course, of previous disasters where we have ended up there, and last summer was no different. In fact, last summer we'll push that red bar off the scale, I suspect, not that I've used a numerical scale. Where the rules change, of course, is where institutions and citizens both become vulnerable, and where we hit this point of vulnerability where a capacity to treat risk is limited and the capacity for consequence is basically unlimited. And that's the space we're now navigating more and more. And I think that for institutions, their leadership and the citizenry to accept the premise of shared vulnerability as well as ultimately shared responsibility is a potential for a really rich conversation. And I've been talking about this for a number of years now, and many people are doing good work in this space. If we go to the next slide, Just on policy challenges, particularly in the space of resilience, and I must correct my own slide here. It's not expected to possess agencies, expected to be able to exercise it. But we're very much in our resilience policies in Australia and overseas, actually, in what I call a red box, which is biased towards an individualistic approach to resilience. So we push the obligation too far to the citizen. If you go back to the pendulum on the second slide, you'll notice that where we've pushed the pendulum is much more obligation on the individual. And it looks kind of like this. So the literature talks a lot about this, and I would certainly support it from my career perspective to say that I've certainly seen this in many places and certainly heard it in the discourse about what we expect from people. The difficulty is that not everybody can do this. Not everybody can do it. The blue box is a more, if you like, communitarian approach, and it's not a full collectivist view, but it is a communitarian view that says, look, at the end of the day, that we need to balance the rights and obligations between the citizen and the institutions in a way that's negotiated through a good democratic process to come to an agreement and move forward collectively about how we deal with this problem. What we tend to find is the governments define the problem and then impose, if you like, expectations on citizenry in order to do something about it. Increasingly, citizens cannot meet this standard, the red standard, or they cannot meet it. One of the reasons they cannot meet it, for example, is to have full situational awareness. That's a great aspiration, but most institutions don't have it. So if the institution doesn't have it, how can the citizen have it, for example? The notion of needing insurance is becoming increasingly unaffordable in Australia for a whole host of reasons. So as I said, this is a teaser of some of the policy challenges. We need to move to get out of the red box and more into the blue box, particularly for those who just don't have a chance to meet this standard of resilience in the individualistic context. If we go to the next slide, I was really captured by this photo. These are the risk reduction policy challenges, and I think that here we've got a citizen who's trying to take the pressure off the response agencies by doing something for himself, and you can see the futility in the circumstance. And we do often talk about, and it came up in my research, that there is an obligation or an expectation that citizens will take the pressure off response by doing things so that agencies can reprioritise their resources elsewhere. But under the circumstances that we faced last summer, is that really a realistic proposition? And I'm not saying necessarily we have to triple the frontline resources in order to ameliorate this, because I think the issue is more complex than that. But this is the result of asking citizens, for example, it's a metaphor, of taking the pressure off response and recovery. So I just think, in some way, shape or form, we need to enter into a new dialogue about how we rebalance this. So the next slide, if I can go to it quickly, is three examples, three very quick case study examples of some public commentary on this obligation on the citizen, or the lack of institutional obligation, if you like, in the space of risk reduction. So the Wagga Wagga Mayor, not that long ago, actually 3 or 4 months ago, made a public statement about North Wagga, the floodplain, the fact that it was a 1 in 8 year floodplain. It was predicted to flood this summer because of the La Nina event. And he essentially said, well, it's the residents' problem. They know that it's a floodplain area. But the interesting thing is that it was many moons ago the council had approved it to start with. And if you knew who lived in North Wagga, you'd see a socio-economically disadvantaged cohort of people that can't afford to trade out to the extent of which, much of privileged Australia would expect them to, for example. So they get structurally locked in, economically, socially locked into their circumstance. They can't trade out, they can't get insurance, and they have repeated impact. A Gold Coast developer had to provide 2 lifeboats, a helipad, 3 days of food supply and a tractor at a residential estate to house 1,500 people. That was in as late as 2013. That consent was given by the local council because they felt that the Land and Environment Court would not uphold their refusal, and so the consent was granted to the development. And in 2019, there was a development built in Hervey Bay, which was about 3 metres from the ocean. From the bay, and the seawall was inadequate to cope with climate change effects and a sea level rise over the next 20 or 30 years. So these disasters are not natural. We continue to place ourselves upon the landscape in ways that are less than helpful. And to Deb's point before about knowledge, values and rules, which I'll come to in a second, those things matter more than ever. about how we're dealing with where we place ourselves on the landscape. So if I move to the next slide, I think this is the second last slide. This just gives you a heuristic of exactly that problem. So you can see values, rules and knowledge on the left there are dominated by the equities of power, wealth and resource, and how those things are distributed is a challenging proposition. But you can see how risk gets created, and quite simply, once somebody has a bright idea, a risk is starting to form. The minute that bright idea turns into an approval, risk is embedded before the first bucket of concrete is poured. And then it ultimately gets transferred to the citizen. But the extent to which the citizens had any say about that risk, or any say about the decisions, the values, the knowledge or the rules that were used in order to make that decision varies widely, and generally speaking is not available to those who have to accept the risk. We then ask them, of course, to be resilient. And if we don't deal with the risk reduction side, if we don't look at knowledge, values and rules more profoundly about how the decisions are being made, then again, the proposition of resilience becomes almost impossible for many. So if we go to the last slide, because I know time is short, the Royal Commission also said this, that it's not just a commitment or purpose, but of action. And only then can Australians have confidence that the arrangements are the best they can be, and the time to act and improve arrangements is now. I think that's a really wise statement. But I also found this in the report as well, that the obstacles to achieving this are around interjurisdictional cooperation. And the Royal Commission very subtly but powerfully made the observation that much of this had been discovered previously, but not implemented, because we end up in a space in Commonwealth state relations which is tense, which is jurisdictional, which is where sovereignty takes precedence, and where many of the recommendations that have been identified earlier actually don't make it. They don't make it through the system, which is in every sense of the word an ethical consideration of leadership. So I'm going to leave it there, Anne. It's just to prompt the conscience, to get people thinking about some of the policy challenges, and I think we've got a little bit of time at the end to take questions if people have any to ask. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. And I just want to do a little plug. The DRSI and the Climate Change Institute is currently organizing an expert panel that's going to look at implementing the Royal Commission recommendations that will be taking place in the second week of December, and we're just fine-tuning the details. So if you are interested, and it will be up on our website as soon as we've got it finalized, and it will be advertised through the Climate Change Institute. But I just thought I'll put in a semi-formal plug for it now. So we will have time for questions, and there's already a lot of very interesting conversation starters coming up, but let's move on to Melissa Parsons. So Dr. Melissa Parsons is a senior lecturer and senior research fellow at the University of New England, and she will be presenting her work on the Australian Disaster Resilience Index and assessment of disaster resilience in Australia. So take it away, Melissa.
Unmute, thank you. I'll just share my screen. Thanks very much. As Anna said, I am at the University of New England in Armidale, so I'm on the country of the Ainawan people, and I pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have joined us for this seminar today. So, the Australian Disaster Resilience Index is the first national scale snapshot of disaster resilience in Australia. Many agencies have developed and still continue to develop strategic programs and frameworks that guide disaster resilience and risk reduction in Australia. But what we didn't really have to support that was a nationally standardised picture of how factors act together to influence the potential to achieve those strategic goals of disaster resilience. So we spent a couple of years developing an index as part of the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, and that was released in July last year, and you can access this publicly available website at that web address there. In the portal, you can explore maps and all kinds of things about disaster resilience in Australia. But really, the data that came out of this research was both abundant and it was complex. So today I just want to provide 3 insights about disaster resilience in Australia: the geography of disaster resilience. The second one is about how many communities share the same enablers of and barriers to disaster resilience. And the third one is really and I acknowledge the role of Mark in getting my thinking going on this point and how it relates to the Disaster Resilience Index, is that the system of disaster resilience is created by powered actors. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I just want to, for people who aren't familiar with the index, I'll just give you a really short background. So we created an index of disaster resilience that was made up of 6 different dimensions of resilience, 2 adaptive capacity dimensions and 6 coping capacity dimensions. And kind of like the system that Deb described earlier, this is our system of social, economic and institutional factors that contribute to disaster resilience. We then took indicators for each of those dimensions and formed them statistically into an index. That index is then used to undertake an assessment of disaster resilience in Australia. What's really important to know here is that the index is based on this idea of capacity for disaster resilience in Australian communities. It's not a measure of actual resilience following any one event, and nor does it assess things about individual or household preparation or risk awareness. It's a top-down assessment of the capacities for disaster resilience in different places that come through this antecedent set of social, economic and institutional factors. So the first insight is about the geography of disaster resilience. So this is the geography of disaster resilience in Australia. The index ranges from 0 to 1, with darker purple being lower capacity for disaster resilience, and the light purple to light green being moderate capacity for disaster resilience, the dark green being high capacity for disaster resilience. And remember that that capacity comes from those 8 different dimensions, which represent the resources and opportunities for both coping with and adapting to natural hazards. So these divisions are SA2 divisions of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and there's about 3,000 of those across Australia. So 3.8 million people, or about 16% of the population, live in areas that were assessed as having low capacity for disaster resilience. 12.3 million people, or 52% of the population, live in areas assessed as having moderate capacity for disaster resilience, and 7.6 million people, or about 32% of the population, live in areas assessed as having high capacity for disaster resilience. What's also important here is that those areas of low capacity for disaster resilience cover 94% of Australia's land area. And those areas of high capacity for disaster resilience are concentrated into less than 0.5% of Australia's land area. There's a really good geographical reason for this. Remote and very remote areas are almost always associated with low capacity for disaster resilience, and that high capacity for disaster resilience is generally associated with metropolitan and inner regional areas. But there are some areas of low capacity for disaster resilience in metropolitan areas. This is a map of the Greater Sydney region, so you can contrast here areas of lower capacity for disaster resilience in southwest Sydney with higher areas, higher capacity for disaster resilience areas in the North Shore, And those areas of high and low capacity often sit side by side. Here's our Prime Minister's electorate in the Shire, sitting side by side with an area of low capacity for disaster resilience in southwestern Sydney. So that's the geography of resilience in Australia. The capacity for disaster resilience is not uniform. Living in an outer regional, remote and very remote area of Australia is associated with lower disaster resilience capacity. The second insight that we came up with from this research to talk to you about today is how many communities share the same characteristics of disaster resilience. So it's kind of one thing to know about the index of disaster resilience, but you may also want to know about how those 8 different factors come together to contribute to disaster resilience in different places. So we used those 8 dimensions of disaster resilience to come up with 5 different groups around Australia. So each of those groups has a different set of strengths and barriers to disaster resilience. So you can explore those groups using the map in the web portal. These maps don't always display very well on screen at a national resolution in PowerPoint. So for now, what I'm going to do is just to quickly take you through those 5 groups and give you at the bottom, there's a few examples of they're just randomly chosen examples of places that fall into those groups. So in group 1, the disaster resilience strengths are contributed through these 5 factors. So emergency service provision, economic capital and planning provisions, and access to digital information. And this one here, governance and leadership, is about the potential for organisations to adapt and transform. But for these places down here, the barriers to disaster resilience are coming through the social elements. So the demographics of vulnerability, which is social character, and a less well-connected and adaptive community setting. There are about 308 places or areas around Australia in this group, and they are spread across metropolitan, regional and remote Australia. Group 2, there's 389 areas in Australia in this group. Disaster resilience strengths come through all of the social and provisioning factors, but the barrier to disaster resilience for this group is information access. And this is mostly the provision of telecommunication services. So I know a lot of you are in Canberra. A lot of the Canberra suburbs actually fall into this group, but that's not because of a lack of information access. It's because they kind of have averages of these sort of strengths that match into the strengths rather than into the barriers. Group 3 is largely made up of outer regional, remote and very remote areas, and as well as some inner regional areas. So our really remote Australia falls into this group. You can notice here that the strengths for this group come from the social factors and the barriers come from the provision of services. So this reflects what we really anecdotally know about regional and remote areas, that there's quite a lot of strong community capital and connectedness in the bush, but a lack of access to services. Some Canberra suburbs also fall into this group, but again, it's based on the strengths rather than on the barriers. In group 4, all the factors that represent disaster resilience are strengths. So this group is good at, has strengths in all of these dimensions of disaster resilience. Most of them are in metropolitan and inner regional areas of Australia, including most of Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne, which falls into that group. Not all of the metropolitan areas, but most of them fall into that group. Group 5 So the last group has strengths contributed through service provision, but barriers to disaster resilience that come from some vulnerabilities in terms of demographics and a less connected community. And again, those tend to occur in metropolitan areas of the major cities. So in terms of our insights about disaster resilience in Australia, we can see that different locations that are on opposite sides of the country or in different jurisdictions can actually share the same strengths and challenges to achieving the strategic goals of disaster resilience. And what that, I guess, means is that strategic planning and investment nationally or in states or regions can be guided by these strengths and barriers to disaster resilience. And it also allows us to say with a bit more confidence, well, what's been shown to work in one place might also work in all of these other similar places. So the last insight is really about what the index says in relation to some well-established patterns of social, economic and institutional advantage and disadvantage in Australia. It's been shown time and time again how regional and remote areas of Australia have poorer health, education, employment, digital access and planning outcomes. So the results from the Disaster Resilience Index also add to that by showing that regional and remote areas of Australia also have poorer disaster resilience outcomes. And while there's that anecdotal social connectedness in the bush and in regional parts of Australia, our population in these areas do face those barriers to disaster resilience that are generated by a whole lot of policy settings that privilege service delivery, investment and economic capital into the populated metropolitan areas. And I think that that privileging has a lot of implications for achieving the strategic goals of disaster resilience or disaster risk reduction at various levels, because in some way, all of our strategies seem to adopt some sort of notion of shared responsibility among individuals, communities, governments and industries. That capacity to share that responsibility is not equal among those sectors. That's nothing new. We kind of have been talking about that for some time. But I think what the index shows is that geography matters. Geography matters because it shows that there is not an equal capacity to share responsibility across Australia. That ability to share that responsibility is not uniform. So asking for that shared responsibility or the participation of all sectors is probably doomed to failure in some locations, because the geography of resilience is an interplay of social, economic, institutional and environmental trade-offs by powered actors, and that those trade-offs are often invisible to, as Mark said, to those individuals who are very diligently doing their fire planning or their storm preparation. So I think I want to end with a bit of a statement that let's not take our eyes off the powered actors in Australian risk reduction settings, because I think that's really where the next incremental step changes need to be coming from. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Melissa. I do know that we've got a question, but if we could just move on to our next speaker. And if you do have questions for particular speakers, do put them in the chat. We'll go through them after everyone else has spoken. So our last speaker for today is Dr. Arnagretta from the College of Health and Medicine here at ANU. And she's a physician, a cardiologist, and a Futures Fellow. And we'll be talking about the link between planetary health and disaster resilience. So over to you, Arnagretta.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for having me in today's panel. It's been a really amazing set of conversations so far, and I'm sorry I missed last week. Again, I've had a look through it, it looks quite good. So I've been tasked with just making some links, I suppose, between disaster resilience and human health and wellbeing. And it's hard not to start by making observations that climate change has a significant health impact and in fact is regarded as the greatest threat to human health in the 21st century by the World Health Organization. And I think in Australia, and particularly in the last couple of years, we've seen textbook examples of how natural disasters impact on our health and wellbeing, particularly through the summer of 2019 and 20 with the fires that we experienced. But it's worth asking the question and I guess fleshing out a little bit to start off with what sorts of health impacts we see from natural disasters. And we see natural disasters as a dominant mechanism by which climate change affects our health and wellbeing. The Summer from Hell, 2019-2020, the textbook example showing us the health impacts of climate change here in Australia. Devastating drought, and we know drought impacts on human health and wellbeing as well as the landscape and animals. Record-breaking heat waves, and heat being the largest driver of natural disaster mortality in Australia. And fires with extraordinary scale and duration. Bushfire smoke that I think unprecedented understates the extraordinary experience we had with bushfire smoke blanketing large parts of Eastern Australia, impacting, we think, about 12 million people across the country over that summer period. So what are the health impacts? And I can particularly speak to the health impacts of bushfires. And this was a publication from March this year in the Medical Journal of Australia that gives us some rough estimates of what sorts of health effects we might see. We know that 37 people were killed from the fires directly. And I think many of us have reflected that that was an extraordinary response, that we had such a small amount of direct mortality from the fires. Probably means we've learnt a lot from previous disasters. We do know that there are about 400 or more people who died from smoke exposure related health complications. But in terms of the health impacts, that often means we're talking about heart and lung disease and hospital admissions in people with underlying comorbidities. The estimates are that thousands of people were hospitalised. As I mentioned, 12 million people exposed to hazardous air pollution. Mental health impacts of these sorts of natural disasters are fascinating and quite significant. And we know that the mental health effects occur both at the time of crisis during the disaster itself and then continue to resonate through the communities for some time afterwards. We are actively interested and working at the moment on how the interrelationship between natural disasters and the subsequent pandemic compound stress for many in our community. And there are many, many, many unanswered questions from our bushfire smoke experience, particularly questions around pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes with relationship to smoke exposure. What happens to our lung function on a community basis, having been exposed to bushfire smoke for the moderate intensity over that summer period? What are the longer term mental health effects of a season like that? And what was the heat mortality effect? And that's just a small smattering, I guess, of the questions that are still, I think, actively being asked. Heat is another natural disaster, which is worth mentioning because it's the natural event that has the highest mortality in Australia. And this is mentioned in the Bushfire Royal Commission, that we don't necessarily make that link between the environmental impact on our health in our health data. And so it's one of the recommendations from the Royal Commission. This table here was a publication from colleagues here at ANU earlier in the year. It's making an argument that perhaps 2% of Australian mortality is attributable to higher temperatures. And in the bottom corner is the mortality effect from the Black Saturday fires in 2009, where about 170 people were killed directly from the bushfire. And the estimated number of people who died over that period from heat was over 300. So it was a significant heat impact effect. What are the other health challenges that we see emerging from climate change? Well, drought has both physiological effects as well as serious mental health effects in communities, and particularly in regional and rural Australia. We know flooding and storm damage can affect communities. Towns without water can see health effects begin to emerge. Health services are compromised, and this was reflected again in the Bushfire Royal Commission discussion, that the compromising of health services so that they're not adequately resourced to deal with the disruption to supply chains and to staffing, etc., from extreme weather events. Changes in patterns of diseases, particularly infections, are well recognised. And so it's worth reflecting on what we already know about human resilience and how we respond after natural disasters, I guess particularly in the Australian context. One of the well-studied events is the Black Saturday fires from 2009. This is of research out of Melbourne at Melbourne University. And they made some very interesting observations, which I think feed nicely into the conversation we're having today. We see high rates of mental disorders and distress that don't last for a short period of time, but that really do resonate for some years after fire. Mental health issues emerge from the loss of life and being around people or having lost loved ones or members of family. The loss of property increases the likelihood of mental health issues, separation from family, and the trauma of being directly exposed to that sort of extreme weather event. One of the points that I think is worth reiterating is that watching trees and bush recover, watching the environmental recovery after a natural disaster actually helps with the emotional recovery for people. And this interrelationship between planetary or environmental health and wellbeing and human health and wellbeing, I really think needs to be fleshed out. Those who stayed behind in the Black Saturday environment on the outskirts of Melbourne benefited from the connection to community, but they suffered in terms of accommodation and financial challenges. And conversely, those who moved away lost that social connection, but had less in the way of challenges of accommodation, finance, and relationship trouble. So that's what we know about the sort of longer term effects of natural disasters such as bushfires. Resilience is an interesting word. Capacity to recover from difficulty and challenges. And I was on the South Coast a couple of weeks ago, and I think we've probably all seen now the way in which the bush is recovering after fire. I've got two contrasting photos there of bush that's recovering nicely, and you can see the growing back undergrowth and the tree canopy that's intact. And on the other side, perhaps a less functional return of landscape with a much more deeply burned environment. And I think that we see that resonate in the human experience after disaster as well. And so I'm going to finish my last few comments around the bushfire or the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements. I think, like all of the other panellists, it's been quite an extraordinary document to read through, and it's great to see the work that's been done on resilience and resilience response being reflected in this quite extraordinary document. I think one of the take-home messages from the Royal Commission review is that natural disasters are changing and that we need to prepare ourselves for increasing intensity and frequency. I was struck by the comment on under number 25 there, that Australia needs to be better prepared for the natural disasters, that they may not happen every year, but when they do happen, they can be catastrophic. And for those of us who are in the ACT, I'm sure this particular line resonates well, that the summer of 2019-20, in which some communities experienced drought, heat waves, bushfires, hailstorms and flooding, provided only a glimpse of the types of events that Australia may face in the future. And I think this preparation and really mapping out what we might be up against in the future is a tremendously important part of building the human psychological resilience and physical resilience to reduce the health impacts that we'll see from natural disasters. The key messages, Mark already went through a number of the key messages from the Royal Commission, but just to rehash that, there's a clear role for government leadership and coordination. We need to work on multiple fronts, a national approach with a greater role for the Australian government across multiple policy areas. And I think that whole of government response was really great to see the recommendations from the Royal Commission, that it's not just about emergency response, but it's a whole of system response to natural disaster preparation and adaptation. There was a call for an increase in the amount of data, so understanding the science being really key to the best way that we can respond, sharing people and resources, supporting individual responses, but as has been mentioned, an individual often really struggles in the face of such extraordinary events like that particular summer and the bushfires. And so making sure that we've got adequate supports and structures in place for individuals and the decisions and the communities that look after them. It needs a whole of nation response. There are a few other points I think to make, and I again really enjoyed the call for strategic imagination and big country thinking. It is time to move past a disaster response towards a more strategic imagination for our human future, and really thinking about resilience and building in our strategic thinking to national disaster management. And we should be working towards embedding it into a lot of the work that we do at a government level, not just about recovery after the fact. So the last reflections, I actually think Deborah O'Connell summarised this quite nicely in the chat a little bit earlier. But health and wellbeing is present through the entire Royal Commission report reflecting on natural disasters. I could see the health impacts and the wellbeing impacts out of almost every recommendation that was made. It's the driver for why we should do better in preparation, adaptation, and building a national resilience. What sort of lessons can we learn from the recent events? Well, we should learn that human health and planetary health are deeply connected, that we use science to shape our experience and to guide our preparation, that imagination, conversations and big thinking will be needed. And if we shift from a disaster reaction to an established whole of system preparation, that has real benefits for, I think, our psychological well-being as we're facing subsequent disasters. Local engagement, but with a whole of continent and perhaps a whole of planet approach might seem useful. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm hoping there might be time for a few questions at the end.